Welcome to Van Steel's instructions for our 63 to 82 front coilover kit. Here we're going to start by removing all the cotter pins, upper ball joint, lower ball joint, and at least your outer tie rod ends. Now if you're placing some of your other steering components, great time to start removing all that as well. Your non-power cars, you got your inner tie rod end, power cars, your valve and ram. You're also going to want to remove your calipers, your rotors. In this car, we were putting on all new components, so we pulled it off all as an assembly. It ended up getting new hubs, rotors, and Wilbur calipers. Next up, we're loosening, not removing, the castle nuts for the upper and lower ball joint. This will be to help retain the car from jolting too much when we're trying to remove the coil spring. Next up, we're removing the sway bar. We're going to start with the end links, getting those out of the way, and then we'll tackle the frame mount bushings. The early cars, especially your 63, 64 cars, don't have tack welded nuts, so you have to get a wrench up in there. All of our C3 guys, while some may be rust welded in, they should just back out for you. We skip showing removal of the shock. So you're going to do that before tackling this next part, where we start backing off the upper ball joint castle nut to relieve the pressure. Since we replace all those components, we take a little shortcut, some liberties here. We just cut the lines, get it out of the way. You can do the same if you're replacing these parts. Time to squeeze in the engine bay and loosen up those alignment stud nuts. If you're replacing your studs, don't remove them completely.
The frame like that. You want your slide hammer? Like that. Alright. So you put it behind the nut, you give it a good whack, it breaks it free. And then from there, undo it by hand and pull it out.
It's tight quarters, but here's where your slide hammer is going to fit. So after removing the upper control arm, you're just going to undo the 3 bolts for the lower control arm, and the spring will come out. It's install time. For that lower control arm rearward bolt, it's a 1/2 inch bolt instead of factory 9/16, so make sure that reducer washer's on there. Make sure the flat on the cross shaft is for your nut. For the front side of the lower control arm cross shaft mount, reuse your factory 2-hole nut plate and thread in these bolts to get it all started. When torquing down the 2-hole nut plate, make sure to work back and forth a little evenly. You don't want to tighten down one side and happen to pinch that clevis or the cross shaft. You want to make sure it secures nice and evenly. Go back and forth. She'll work out nice for you. Next up, you'll tighten that rear bolt. Cinch down. Away we go. The upper control arms are next. How to tell which is the left or right? The more angled side will be towards the front. Your upper ball joint will be moved towards the back 5/8 of an inch. That's what gets us the extra 6 degrees of caster. If you've left your studs in, be a little more work to kind of work her in there. If you're putting in new studs, just follow along. Before setting those new studs, if you're replacing them, go ahead and put on your hardware for the upper control arm. For those of you that are installing upper studs like we are, grab an old extension so you can punch those guys in. Before installing the coilover shocks, make sure that thick washer is on top of the clevis so it sits inside the relief at the top of the frame. When tightening the clevis upper nut, make sure to pin the clevis like shown here with a flathead screwdriver to keep it from spinning. You want to make sure the head of the bolt stays towards the front of the car. As a starting point for your alignment, we do one thick shim towards the front, two thin shims toward the back. Before installing the lower shock mount, make sure to leave that collar all the way down. It's zipped up for shipping to make sure the spring doesn't flop around. This will make pushing the shock up easier so you can get the bolt in. Now's a good time to make sure your steering links are all back in, make sure your cotter pins are set, everything's torqued down. Now's the time to install the sway bar and the frame mount bushings. There is a washer that goes between the gold bracket and the frame that helps alleviate pressure so we don't over tighten the sway bar. We want it to move freely. So once you tighten down those frame mounts, make sure that bar moves freely up and down. We don't install the end links until the car is on the ground, whether you're on ramps or four-post lift. You want to make sure the full weight of the car is on, body, motor, all those happy components.